Greetings, this is GBA 383. The class is Business and Society, and we are working on Chapter 5, Ethics and the Environment. And if you have listened to the news any time in the last decade, you've heard the debate that goes on about global warming and climate change and the impact on the environment and issues around deregulating so businesses can do what they want to do. But unfortunately, with deregulation comes often a lot of pollution and major issues with the environment and the impact on the environment. So we will talk today in this lecture about the ethics of the environment and environmental care and how each of the different theories have a voice in what it means to be ethical in the way that we treat our environment. There are 4 learning objectives for this chapter. Number 1, we're going to look at the environmental threats that are related to the production of consumer goods. And that could be things that impact our ability to produce good things, as well as the impact on the environment when we produce consumer goods. Either way, there are things like pollution and issues like that, water supplies and what have you. Number 2, we're going to examine the important ethical considerations of pollution control. And so what would the ethical theories say about the notion of pollution? Is pollution a necessary evil? Is it something that we just have to accept, or is there a way that we can manage the environment and manage our production in an ethical manner? Number 3, we're going to assess the approaches to internalizing the external costs of pollution. So is there a way for us to take on the cost of pollution? And then lastly, evaluating the ethics related to the conservation of resources for future generations. And this goes back to that notion of, do we have an obligation to conserve resources so that our children and our children's children and our ancestors, the generations that follow us, not our ancestors because they're behind us, but the generations that follow us, do we have an obligation ethically to conserve resources for future generations? And depending on what culture you talk to, that's an absolute important issue. I mean, we look at Native American culture. Native American culture believes that we need to consider our implications for 7 generations ahead of us. We look at Asian cultures, and they care an awful lot about that long-term mentality ahead of us in terms of whether or not there's value in that. So I think it's incredibly important for us to consider all of those elements as we get into this material. 2 basic issues that we address in this chapter are what external elements have an impact on our ability to produce goods, specifically natural environment issues, consumer-related issues, and then what environmental issues must we address in that context. Number 1 is the pollution issue, and which is the output of our process of producing goods, and what impact does that output have? And then the resource depletion is in the input side of things. If we are using a lot of raw materials, finite materials, how long can we sustain doing this and depleting the environment? We see this as an issue with water, with wood. The cost for wood is going up. The shortages on many areas, on many raw materials, fossil fuels and things like that. How do we deal with this issue? So, from the external environments, obviously the big issue is the raw materials that are available for us, right? And sort of that natural side of things is what raw materials are available and what impact does our production process have on the availability of raw materials or just the local environment. Because if we're producing something and we pollute the environment, we not only are we having an impact on our production of the resources that we need to make our goods and services, but it also has an impact on things like water. So the output from our production may not be something that we definitely use as an input. So we're not necessarily depleting a resource as an input, but we're having a detrimental impact on it as an output, meaning that, we're polluting the air and we are polluting the water. When I grew up, you know, polluting was just taken for granted. We threw things out windows. I know it's hard to even imagine that, 50 years ago or more, that this was something that we did without even thinking about it. And we recognize now that when we invest time in making sure that we've got clean water, clean air, it's better for health outcomes for everybody. It's better for our planet. It makes us more sustainable and able to live longer with higher quality of life. It's why we banned lead paint. It's why we make sure that the particulate matter in pollution is at the lowest possible ability, because if people can't breathe the air, it becomes toxic. This can be harmful. So those environmental issues deal with, obviously, the undesirable and unintended contamination of the environment. And for some people, maybe it is unintended. There are companies that purposefully and intentionally contaminate the environment because they don't care. But pollution assumes that people, the theory behind this, it assumes that people don't want to necessarily, contaminate their environment. But we know that there are people out there that do, whether it's the waste from the output of what we are creating, chemicals, byproducts, you name it. And then the resource depletion is where we simply use up all the available resources, where there's nothing left for us to use. I mean, our world is finite. There are not infinite resources. And while many people argue right now, we have plenty of resources for now, so we should just take care of ourselves now, there are other ethical perspectives that say we need to consider the long-term implication. And if we make our planet uninhabitable by using up all of our resources, what does that do for us and for our society in the future? So it really depends on whether you have a short-term perspective and a long-term perspective on these kinds of issues. So let's start with discussing the dimensions of pollution and resource depletion. Number one, what are some of those dimensions? Common air pollutants, carbon dioxide emissions, toxic waste, and energy consumption. It's using electricity, using natural gas, using fossil fuels to and using them and depleting them, right? So the air pollutants and the emissions and the wastes versus the consumption of as many things as we can. So what are some of those concerns that we have? Well, if you look at what the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is responsible for environmental issues here in the United States, in 2013, the United States pumped more than 94 million tons of air pollutants into the air: smoke, lead, carbon dioxide. These have toxic implications for people. People who ingest lead end up with brain damage, and they die from lead poisoning. Carbon monoxide also can cause death if you ingest carbon monoxide, because it replaces other essential mechanically, the way this works is it replaces and it bonds to parts of your lungs so that you can't get the oxygen in that you want. So it replaces oxygen. So the carbon monoxide in the air you can die from that. And my grandfather actually died from carbon monoxide poisoning, so I'm pretty sensitive to that issue. Smoke, when we're breathing in smoke, there are pollutants in there that can infect our lungs, inflame our lungs, make it difficult for us to breathe, creating problems with asthma. And asthma is a growing concern, no longer just among small groups. In areas, it's not necessarily just genetic, it actually has environmental implications. And so we need to make sure that air is clean in order, when we're asthmatic, having clean air is essential for us to not have our lungs spasm and then not be able to breathe. So in addition to that, we see 6.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions also are going into the environment. And with those carbon dioxide emissions, we know from the way greenhouses work, right, that carbon dioxide heats up the environment. And so when we are using a greenhouse, oxygen comes in, the plants will uptake carbon dioxide and create oxygen, but in that process, right, of taking in carbon dioxide and making oxygen, what it's doing, that process heats up the atmosphere. And so what we're starting to see with more and more carbon dioxide emissions, that average temperatures are going up more and more. That's not to say that there aren't normal fluctuations in temperature and carbon dioxide. Absolutely, there are normal fluctuations in this just based on the environment. Even if we had no technology, right? We saw ice ages, we saw all sorts of things in terms of the cycle of the environment. But what environmentalists are arguing is it's not that we have caused the fluctuation, but that we are exacerbating the fluctuation. And what that means is if it fluctuates between, let's just use a number for illustration, if it fluctuates between -1 and +1 on a normal basis, right, whatever that means, right? When it exacerbates it, it means it goes from -5 to +7, right? It's going to fluctuate at extremes much more so because of the carbon dioxide emissions. So again, carbon dioxide emissions are not the only cause. There are natural fluctuations, but they make it worse if we don't manage it well, and that creates problems for the environment. The U.S. has produced 3.9 billion tons of toxic waste, and toxic waste comes from chemicals and chemical processing. Any kind of manufacturing process often has output along with the product and service, the product that they're making. The output from that process can be toxic, and so it can be heavy metals, it could be polluted waters. It could be air pollution, whatever it is. So those toxic wastes are the things that are the byproduct of nuclear chemical manufacturing processes. When we think about Bhopal, India, and Union Carbide, that was a great example of the system in place that never that released toxic chemicals into the air, and so that was the toxic waste that happened from the manufacturing process out there, and it killed and maimed and injured so many people in Bhopal, India. I mean, then that's not just the only issue. We also have to consider nuclear waste. And what impact nuclear waste has. If you look at locally here in the St. Louis area, looking at the Bridgeton landfill, and it has nuclear waste there, and that's always a concern for people who live near the Bridgeton landfill, is the nuclear waste that's there and the toxic waste that's there, which is polluting the environment. So again, important issues to consider. Our total energy consumption is about 17 and a quarter billion barrels of oil, or 721 billion gallons of gasoline. So our energy consumption is going up. And here's the challenge, right? With energy consumption going up, we cannot assume that oil and gas are an infinite resource. They're not. And eventually it'll run out. And many people will argue, well, why should we worry about that now? Well, that's the ethical question, right? Should we worry about it now? Or should we leave that for future generations? Can we do something now to make it easier for future generations to manage this? That's the question. Each U.S. citizen annually accounts for the consumption of about 1,300 pounds of metal and 18,500 pounds of other minerals, and we produce over 7 pounds of garbage every day of the year. That's a lot of garbage. And so Minerals, what kind of minerals are we talking about? Metals, whether it's aluminum, whether it's getting rid of an iPhone and we don't recycle it, we throw it in the garbage, and we see some of the metals that are in the chips, and some of the elements that are involved in creating chips that have, in our computers, all sorts of things. And so just general, just general consumption of goods, and what we do, the garbage that we produce alone, what do we do with it? Where does it go? Do we burn it? Do we bury it? I used to live on Staten Island, and the Fresh Kill landfill there, which is no longer being used, is huge. I mean, you can literally see it from the atmosphere. If you're flying in an airplane pretty high up, you can see it. It's pretty profound how big it is, and what it produces, in terms of off-gassing and stuff like that. Funny story, when I lived on Staten Island, we were driving by the dump, and it had this horrible smell. And, my ex-husband thought that my daughter's diaper was full because it smelled so bad. And she started, he started teasing her about it. And she says, "No, it's the dump. It's stinky. It's the stinky dump." And of course it was. I mean, she was old enough to not have a diaper, but, it was just a funny story, in our family, about how we even recognized that smell and how bad it was for the environment. I mean, it's pretty toxic. I mean, I've had family that grew up around, oil refineries, and they ended up having a lot of problems with their lungs and lung damage, which is kind of scary. So what are some of the essential questions and issues? What is the extent of damage that is happening to the environment? Again, differentiating between normal fluctuations, which we know does happen, and the impact of human behaviors on the environment. And how can we mitigate that? How can we manage that? How can we slow down the process of harming, the harm that's coming to the environment? Then we need to talk about the extent of the threat to life and health. So are people being sick? Are they dying from the pollution, and what impact that has? Are we responsible for damage to the environment and harm to life, health and life? So what responsibility do we have for that? And then obligations of the firm to minimize, reduce, or reverse environmental change. So to what extent are we obligated to mitigate this and to try to do what we can to either slow or reverse environmental damage? And that's an ethical question, one of which that I buy into, that I believe that we do have a responsibility for that. Not everybody necessarily agrees with that, and I can understand that, but we need to do something. We cannot continue to harm the planet, because we need fresh water, we need clean air. We can't pull trees, because trees pull carbon dioxide out of the environment, and it helps us, right, to make sure that we've got good oxygen available for us to breathe. So we need trees, we need green grass. We cannot have everything to be industrial buildings and manufacturing environments. We need green spaces to do this.